Hi there, this is Tim.
And Keaton Clark, first year painting student.
And today we're looking at an anatomy study of an eye. This is our first video of the CPC301 class, our portrait class. And we begin this course with a series of studies of all the face features of the face. So first we start with the eye, then we'll do the nose, then mouth, and then ear, with the intent that after that we can do an extended portrait where we kind of put together all of this knowledge that we gained from these studies to create a portrait over the course of several days. So we're starting first with the eye, and actually you'll notice that I'm beginning this the same way that we began the feature studies of an eye in drawing. So there should be a lot of familiarity with this. You should have done enough feature studies by now that you are comfortable at least with getting the box and scheme and shadow map established, and a good shape of no-tan shape of an eye first, even before we jump in with some color, because there's nothing worse than having to significantly correct the drawing aspect of your feature and then losing all of the color quality that you've gained from it. So I'm spending a little extra time here in the beginning just getting the drawing right. What you'll see is that I start each of these a little bit differently, so you can sort of pick and choose how much preliminary work you would like to do for each of these studies, if you want to really draw it out first, or if you just want to knock right in with some color. So I encourage you to review each of these studies before kind of making a decision, and make that decision based off of your comfort level. What you'll also notice is that most of these are painted up to be pretty refined by the end. There's some degree of looseness from feature to feature, but for the most part these are what we would consider really studied paintings, meaning there's a lot of refinement that's gone into them, a lot of subtle shifts and transitions, with the goal being more to explore with as much gentle color and value shifts as possible the anatomy of each of these features, as opposed to, for example, suggesting them as we would in an alla prima painting, which you'll be able to see in a later video down the road here. So you can actually opt to do either method. You can opt to do the sort of abstract shapes that create the realism that's associated with alla prima painting, or one of these more studied features. I would actually encourage you to do both. That's usually the question I get, well, which should I do? And I say, you should do them both. It's in doing these longer studied pieces that we gain some knowledge and insight into the anatomy and the color shifting, and then that can help us to better inform some of the abstract decisions associated with direct or alla prima painting. So even though we're going to see mostly the more studied versions here, you can review the alla prima video and see some of the choices made to create the more abstract versions. And then there's also, of course, master copies. Doing eye studies and nose studies and ear studies by Sargent and Soroya and Zorn, those will give you some great insight into how to do feature studies in the way of the masters. And so that should be a high priority if you're interested in that type of painting. But either way, you should be doing, hopefully before you're even working with the model, some feature studies from a master copy from the artist that you wish to study. That will sort of set your bar for how the development of each of these should go. And keep in mind, you want to do it so many times that it becomes comfortable, so that when you do work with the model, you're not struggling over what steps you should do next with the painting. You're actually instead able to make the more critical decisions of taking what you're observing from life and translating it into that abstraction on the canvas. You might also notice that I'm starting with a heavily toned canvas here, something along a mid-value, around a value 5 or 6 here. And this is very similar to the value of the paper of from the drawing year. Our toned paper that we worked on to do a lot of these feature studies is actually a little bit darker. It's a little more clearly right in between light and dark, so there's no ambiguity here. But it's the same sort of concept. This will allow me to keep my brushes separate, so I can have a brush for lights and a brush for darks. It helps me make easier choices when I'm even constructing this shadow map here, as far as which shape is going to be lighter than this toning and which shape is going to be darker than this toning. So it should provide a more natural, easy transition for those of you who have completed the drawing bundle and are working towards the painting assignments now. It should feel very natural working on this toned canvas here. One distinction I should make is that I am working with a charcoal pencil here. Now, we did do that on toned paper last year, so that should be pretty familiar, but just keep in mind that I want to do this with a charcoal pencil and not with willow, because there is some binder here in the pencil, which will allow for a little bit more permanence when I start to lay some of that color down. If you do work with willow, there is a chance that if you get a little too much thinner, for example, in your paint, it could completely wash that drawing off. So it's very similar to how even after a transfer drawing, I'll go over the willow transfer lines with some charcoal pencil to add a little bit more permanence to the drawing. Now, the pencil hardness you select is actually determined by mostly by your canvas. The tooth or texture or absorbency of your canvas will sometimes allow for an HB or a 2B, or sometimes require a 6B to actually be able to get those lines off onto the canvas. So sometimes I've had to switch up partially through a drawing like this because I'm just not getting enough marks made on the canvas. I'm seeking out that structure of the eye, thinking also in terms of bridgement here as far as some of the overlaps and the tucks of lines to give me some dimensionality. And then of course the Van der Poel idea of where the levels of the eye are, the tear duct versus the outside of the eye, where the main curvatures and peaks of the curvatures of the eye are, avoiding that sort of generic kind of almond-shaped eye, and then really seeking out where each of the curves should be set.
So if you wanted to erase out some of the drawing you've done, how would you do that without taking off the toning?
It's very difficult to, almost impossible. So I would recommend building it up lightly, like we did with the pen drawings in the Van der Poel, the ballpoint pen drawings, and then slowly getting it harder and harder and harder, or like the Bridgman drawings, to mitigate the amount of erasing you do, because that will strip away the toning and make, sort of negate the positive effects that it has. I'm going in here with some darks for my notan here. I'm going to seek out the notan, decide if I really like it or if I need to adjust some shapes before I jump into some more permanent color. And I'm working with a little bit of thinner on here. I do want this to be able to set up and dry for me to be able to layer relatively quickly. And I think my primary goal here is going to be to hit this drawing and notan underpainting in the first sitting with the model. That will allow me to successfully get the model back into pose, or if at any time I need to, tilt the model's head to get the angles correct with my eye here. And remember, those angles are important. Where the peaks of the curves are and where the levels of the eye are, that completely tells the viewer how much the model is turning and if their head is tilted in any direction. Mostly using just burnt umber here. It's a nice sort of generic dark brown. She does have a lot of kind of golden skin tones in here, and so that umber will sort of sparkle through some of these layers, or at least, very least, potentially mix in with some of the top layers, and that's why I want to keep it keyed close to the actual color of her flesh tone. I've seen some people do underpaintings in a color family that's just so different from the model, in the hopes that it creates, I don't know, some optical vibrancy when they lay down those top strokes. But I've seen it where it hasn't been done carefully enough, and those top colors just kind of mix with that underpainting, and then it just really kills the color out. So this is a sort of more classical idea of just getting a nice, deep, dark brown to lay in all these darks. I'm working with a flat bristle brush here. comes to a nice chiseled edge, and that edge allows me to actually create some really nice, sharp, clean lines with the edge of my shapes. I'm not thinking too much about edges now, except to know that I don't want any of them to be soft. It's just like in drawing, when we knock those notans in, we want there to be no ambiguity whatsoever. I don't want to do any artificial blending too early before I've really laid down the darks, because that artificial blending will obscure the accuracy of my drawing at this point. So I really want to lay this in confidently, for right or for wrong, so that I can make a critical assessment if any changes need to be made.
Are you using binoculars at all?
I don't think I am, and I'm pretty far away actually, so I'm having to rely a little bit on my anatomical knowledge to guide some of this drawing choices. I might later on pull out some binoculars to get the color notes a little more clearly, but I shouldn't need any at this stage if I know enough about portrait anatomy. If I don't, then I should definitely pull out some binoculars. But if that's the case, I should also be doing more drawing studies too.
Okay. Yeah, because I was wondering how you decided to put in the darks of the where the eyelid overlaps, the crease there.
How I decided to do them?
Yeah, well, because the picture, if you squint at it, it's darker, but I imagine from a distance that'd be like sort of a fuzzy area.
Yeah, that's true. But eventually you train your eye to see better and better and better. And I am only something like 10 feet away. We can do a pretty good job recognizing a notan from that distance. If I was maybe 15 or 20 feet away, then it would be a little more ambiguous. That's kind of what we're going to see with the Alla Prima portrait. I'm 15 or 20 feet away, and it does get quite a bit more ambiguous, and in fact just more simple in general. Okay. You can still clearly see a notan, but it's just a lot more stuff is smashed together. But again, for this, I'm really having to rely on a lot of my anatomical knowledge to be able to set some of this stuff in.
Okay.
I would actually discourage the use of binoculars this early on, just in general, because the tendency is to end up noodling so much in specific tiny little details that the overall relationship to everything else is lost. So in trying to get a tiny angle, you lose that angle's overall relationship to the bigger main angles of the drawing. And then we tend to make a lot of mistakes very early on. We focus too much on the micro and not enough on the macro.
How do you decide where to vignette or abstract the eye? When do you stop painting?
You mean just as an aesthetic choice in general? Or, I mean, this is a study of an eye, so I want to get the eye inside of a socket. It's my main goal. And then beyond that, it's just a little bit of reservation to ensure that I don't go too far. Working with a study like this where you have one day with the model, there's only so much we can paint, and the tendency is, that I've noticed for a lot of students is, once you kind of hit the limit of what you're able to see on the model and how you can determine if it's different than what you've painted, the student tends to just paint more out around the eye instead of forcing themselves to see more. And that would be a case where that's the time to pull out the binoculars, and that's the time to get closer, and that's the time to see more and more. But in this case, I'm thinking anatomically about the eye. I know the eye has to sit in a socket for it to look right, and so that socket gives a lot of information about the eye, so I'm building up information around there. The nose is a protruding form, for example, that's independent of a lot of the surrounding areas, so for the nose I can just hit the side planes in the front and the ball of the nose, and that's pretty much it. The mouth requires a bit of the muzzle to be painted around it, to put it in context and give it enough shape. And then the ear can pretty much be painted in isolation of its surroundings. So I'm kind of thinking about how integrated it is to the surrounding structures and how relevant those surrounding structures are to give context to the eye itself.
Mhm.
But if you do find yourself wandering too much, I would actually encourage you to paint a smaller area instead of a larger area. So maybe just the eye and the eyelids.
Okay. So my instinct is always to go lighter with the white of the eye. Why is that?
I think it's because it's a small light shape surrounded by dark shapes,
Okay.
and so we tend to misinterpret it as being a little bit lighter. And we also have that misconception that just by the very name of it, it's the white of the eyes is white, when it's really not. It should really be called the gray of the eyes. And if we remember that eyeballs are reflective because of their moisture and the quality of their surface, there typically is some amount of highlight somewhere on the eye, which means the white of the eye could never even be white. So as long as we remember that, we can hopefully remember to knock down the white of the eye and limit how light it is. If you have a tendency to paint the whites of the eye too white, then I would actually suggest painting the darks around it first. Then you'll be able to slowly build lightness to the white of the eye instead of laying it in too early and realizing it's just far too light. This video, as well as the other face feature videos, are shot in real time. So we have a 3-hour session with the model that came out to be 2 hours and almost 14 minutes here. So we actually stayed on pretty good schedule with the model this time. We only lost 45 minutes to our breaks. So we'll get to paint a little bit more than is usual in a 3-hour block, which is good. And we'll get to advance the painting just a little bit more. So keep in mind, we're still in the first sitting here. I'm trying to resolve as much underpainting as I can in this first sitting so that I can really dig into some color in the next sitting here.
Magic palette.
Magic palette. And now is the time to dip into some color here. So I'm working with my my patented palette, one might say, or color arrangement. The palette is actually a parallel palette by David Casson. It's great to be able to really get your color right next to what you're painting and really noodle in some specific, nice, small patches of color. The color arrangement is something I came up with and started teaching to help organize students' understanding of values a little bit better. So I have essentially groups of red and yellow and blue, 5 groups to be exact. The top left, I didn't have time to set out my light yellow, light red, and light blue. This is before I started tubing those light colors, which I now actually have tubes of the light yellow, light red, light blue. So I just have some white there, but I'll try to avoid it at all costs, except for maybe the highlights. The next group on the top right is a cad yellow. I have a lemon and a medium there, and then a cad red light, and then a king's blue. So everything on the top row represents what's going to go in the light side of the of my paintings here. So anything that's in the lights, and in this case, that would represent anything really that's the tone of the canvas or potentially a little bit lighter. And then on the second row, we have sort of 3 other groups of red, yellow, and blue. On the left, we have yellow ochre, cad red medium, and a phthalo with white, which is a cerulean replacement. That's going to represent my exact mid value. If those are blended in equal influence, they will be completely gray, neutral mid value. In the middle there, we have a transparent oxide yellow with a burnt sienna with a cobalt blue. That will handle, between those 2 groups on the bottom left there of red, yellow, and blue, that will handle all of the stuff on my darks. And then on the right, I have my accent color family, which is my alizarin, my burnt umber and my ultramarine blue. And that will handle all of the dark accents that I have. So for example, in the eyelids, I should be able to hit that. And I've started this painting with essentially two giant puddles, a giant puddle for my light and a giant puddle for my dark. As long as I keep those puddles pretty clear, I should have a much easier time. I've essentially mapped out all of my values in the first sitting with the model, so that has told me where on my palettes to pull my red, yellow, and blue from. So I just will identify the family, and then I will start with that color, and then I'll add the additional blue, or the additional two opposing colors until I've adjusted the chroma or the leaning of that family as needed to achieve the correct color at the correct value. If I need to lighten or darken the color, as opposed to using a generic light like white or a generic dark like umber or black, I will instead dip into the color family that's directly adjacent. So either the group of red, yellow, and blue that's a little bit darker, which is what I just did here, to darken that stroke up a bit, or I would go lighter to the group right above. Now, in this case, I've clearly segregated my lights and my darks on my drawing, so I know that anything in the dark has to come from my bottom row, anything from the light has to come from my top row. This will keep all of my colors, especially my shadows or my darker than midtones, really rich, really chromatic, and thus make the painting glow. A big struggle students have is with chalky colors, and that's the tendency to really load too much white into colors, especially dark colors. You know, they get a dark color that they really like, but they want it a little bit whiter or a little bit lighter. So they add a tiny bit of white to lighten up that color, and that starts to kill the chroma and gets chalky right away. So I'm being very clear that on my shadow side, I don't dip into that top row of colors for anything. I just modulate the value with my reds and yellows and blues from the lower bar. That will keep all my shadows rich and chromatic, and thus keep all of my flesh tones very, very rich. The light side of flesh is, by its very nature, light and thus a little less chromatic, and so it's okay that that top row has white in it. That doesn't actually affect the chalkiness of the painting as much as losing that chroma and losing the richness of value in the shadows. So I just want to make sure that my shadows stay nice and rich using only that bottom row of colors. I'm using a rosemary mongoose brush here. That allows me to lay some paint on pretty directly and without too much thinner here. You know, it's nice and soft, but it's also firm.
Are you using separate brushes for your lights and darks?
I usually try to, unless I have a transition value to make, which right now I'm laying into a transition value. It's not as dark as my dark side, it's not as light as my light side, so I can use either brush in this case. I think I used the dark brush there, and I added some light from the group right above to it to make my gray for the white of the eye. Here I'm actually doing a drawing measurement just to make sure it's accurate, and then adjusting where that pupil is, or the iris there. So if I start mixing in this sort of mid-value here, and I notice that it becomes as dark as the value to the left or as light as the value to the right, then I'll transition to a different brush. Or I might even scrape the puddle off altogether. Eventually what tends to happen is we'll see my palette looking like a string of values, where in this case it'll be the darks on the left is where I started, the lights on the right is where I started, and then as I mix the transition values in between, it'll just create this nice bar of subtle grays and browns that go from the left to the right. I'm not always consistent with which side I put my light or my dark on. That doesn't really matter to me as much. It's just whatever's more convenient to when I'm painting at the time. But the consistency of the idea of starting with the dark on one side and the light on the other, and then merging them as time goes on, is always there.
Is that your lightest value that you just put in?
It's not the lightest value, but it's certainly the most chromatic in the lights, which makes it read as lighter. I don't think it's any lighter than the value above the eyebrow, but it is richer in color. So you see, with this method of mixing, I can get just subtly darker and darker as I go, and I can always see how my new stroke will compare to the previous strokes. What we'll see here too is something that is not new from any of the other videos, but it's something worth mentioning again. It's this idea that I'm mixing so much on the canvas, just mixing and mixing and mixing, and then I'll lay just a stroke or maybe 2 strokes on the canvas. So most of the work is done on the palette. I'm not trying to stretch each little piece of color as far as it can go. I'm really trying to be as selective as possible, with this knowledge that in nature there's infinite subtlety and complexity, and so if I can't see that, then that is my fault. I can't blame my model and say, well, it looks the same there as it does there as it does there, because we know from the rules of the universe that that is not true. And if we take that knowledge to just admit that it's an inherent issue with, in this case, myself, and not with the, say, flatness of the model, then that encourages me to look a little more carefully, and really force myself to find what the subtle change is and lay it down there, instead of just being complacent with this one generic color that looks okay and laying it everywhere. Looking okay is not the goal here. The goal here is to get it to look as good as it possibly can, and so that requires tapping into this subtlety of nature and trying to push and modulate and vary my color and my value as much as I can from stroke to stroke. And so that's why these big mixes of color on the palette are a good method, because it allows me to introduce a little bit of color and just subtly change the piece of color that I'm working with, instead of really trying to come up with a new color from scratch every single time, which would be really, really time consuming, and sort of beyond, I think, the skill level of most people. But instead I can just do these subtle little changes, and then I push myself to find the next subtle change. It has to be a value change, a chroma change, or potentially a color family change. In this case, the color family changes are not as common. It's still kind of in this yellow gold everywhere, but there are areas where it leans a little more greenish yellow gold, as in this case, a little more reddish gold, a little more yellowish in general. And so I need to find where those leans are. Those leans in color family tend to happen a lot more when you're dealing with low chroma situations. A lot of low chroma browns or low chroma, what we interpret as grays, because it takes just the smallest amount of color to lean that gray into its adjacent family. And then there's also, of course, the chroma change. So I really need to detect, is it a color change? Is it a value change? Is it a chroma change? And really push myself to create a change, even if it's the most subtle of subtle changes, and lay it in.
Would you say that's one thing that separates a student from a professional, is seeing all the small, really subtle changes like that?
I wouldn't say seeing, I would say willing to try to see.
Okay.
Because this is a case, I think, where you could set a dozen professional artists around the model. They would all interpret the colors a little bit differently. They would all look good, but what you would see is sort of different choices for some of these subtleties of color that don't look wrong but all work together. And it doesn't mean that everybody's seeing color the same way or has the ability to see color the same way, but I think it gives testament to the fact that everyone is recognizing that there are shifts in color and chroma and value, and they are attempting to some degree to fulfill those shifts. Um, Nowadays we don't work as formulaically as we did historically, where everybody trained under a few various workshops throughout Europe, and so everybody was taught, well, this is the subtlety that you put in here, and this is how you transition here. So back then, a lot of the colors are a little more consistent when we look at museum works, whereas here, everyone's kind of trying to figure it out on their own nowadays, and so we all see differently. But those professionals are the stubborn ones, who push through and really force themselves to see, and they understand that a lot of their training comes down to how well or how much they can see, or how delicately they see, or walking that fine balance between the simplest enough to be as simple as they can make it while still having enough information to pull through, and that's an even finer balance to walk. That's really tough to pull off. But yeah, I think it's that willingness really more than anything. Instead of brushing off with the excuse, and this is the excuse that we get all the time from students, is, well, I just don't see that. Well, that doesn't mean you shouldn't try. That's just throwing in the towel and trying to excuse your painting as, to be poor just because you can't see it. So I think that is kind of what separates the amateurs from the pros in this case. I'm always continued to be amazed that the best and typically most technically advanced painters that I've met are also the most humble painters I've met. I meet students all the time who say, "Oh, I'm a good painter," or "I have experience painting," or I've made lots of good paintings," and they sort of toot their own horn about how good they are. And then some of the really, really knockout, amazing painters are always, perhaps sometimes a little bit insecure, but always kind of open to this new idea of somebody else being a really good painter and saying, "Oh, wow, that's such a good painting. I wish I could do that." And they're always envious about someone else's skill, and they always recognize this need to advance their own craft further and further and further. And they're never quite good enough, and that's why they push harder and harder. And that's really what makes them pros. But they don't walk around saying how awesome they are. They're always trying to push themselves further, and they're always open to learning a lot more and observing a lot more. And that openness to learn is the same sort of skill set, or maybe emotional skill set, that feeds that force that pushes them to see even further. I'm trying to be pretty select with the lines that I lay in here, with this knowledge that as I lay those darker accent lines in, they're a little bit thicker, so I'm going to go over them with slightly lighter color to knock down some of the edges and create the transitions. I don't want anything on the painting to appear like a line, and that comes with this understanding that any sort of line look that I put in there has to have its edge modulated on all sides. So in the case of the crease right above the eyelid that I laid in, what you can observe from the reference photo even is that it gets softer on the top side, harder on the bottom side. That falls in with our understanding of form shadows, where the bottom side represents more of an occlusion, the pinching out of light between the eyelid and the socket, and the top side represents a form shadow of the skin in the eye socket folding down to create that crease. So those are edges that will be modulated in order for these little tiny pieces to not look like lines. And I think students do have a struggle with this idea of painting these small features, which, especially from a distance, really look just like lines. And it really flattens out the painting to lay it in that way. So we have to make sure that we use our, this time, understanding of form and how light falls on form to create edge structure to go back and manipulate some of those pieces later on. Now, of course, you would want to, especially in the early stages, attempt to manipulate as much of that as you can using just the addition of paint, and then later on go back and softening it to ensure that all of your colors stay nice and rich and separated.
eye always looks so dead until you get the highlights in. Would you recommend not putting them in until the very end? I always think that.
That's an interesting observation, because I think it's something that most people would share that view. And you're probably referring to sort of the luminosity and the sheen that's created.
Yeah.
And yeah, that is created by the highlight. Using the word dead can be a little confusing, and I, as a painter, as a craftsman, I always try to remove any of those words that seem too, I don't know, too less objective, I guess, that don't really give information as to a solution to shape, value, edge, or color. And because everybody also, I meet lots of students, everybody has a different set of adjectives they use to describe things, and they don't always, make sense to everybody else. And so I don't even really analyze a painting with those subjective adjectives as I'm working on it. So something like that wouldn't even cross my mind, because I'm just really squinting and seeing the abstract shapes and laying them in, and I don't really care if things look dead or glowy or any of those range of positive or negative things, because I'm just trying to paint little abstract shapes as they are, until maybe on a break or towards the end of the session I'll look at it and say, oh, well, it looks this, and so, some insert adjective here, and then I have to do the sort of backwards route of saying, okay, well, it can look like this because of not rich shadow colors or soft mushy edges or something like that. So there is a danger, just to point out, in jumping to a conclusion like that too early on, because that is what I see, especially in an open studio, that drives people to make premature marks or incorrect corrections that actually ultimately destroys their painting instead of resolving it to get the effects that they were wanting to get. Now, the little highlight in the eye is always a big crowd pleaser, and everybody wants to paint the eye so they can put in that little bing of a highlight. But we do need to remember that it is an incredibly tiny accent shape, first of all, meaning it should come much later on. And secondly, in at least this case, it is a tiny light shape surrounded by a field of dark, meaning if I lay it in and it's wrong, I'm going to have much harder time salvaging the painting. And also, it needs to be very, very hard-edged, which means I have to consider the paint application aspect of it as well. How am I going to approach laying in a very small, very hard-edged shape without it getting mushy? I have to think about the setup time of the paint, how much I'm going to work the surrounding areas. In the case of highlights, almost every artist, or at least historical text that you find, will tell you to paint the structure of something before you put in a highlight. A highlight is sort of a superfluous extra little thing that you put in, but you could probably get away without putting in. Also, highlights can shift or move around depending on how the viewer sits in relation to the subject, meaning there's a little more flexibility. Whereas the center light and the halftones and the occlusions, those all describe light and structure as opposed to just light. And so we would really want to get something that looks really solid, really refined, before we hit those tiny little accent details in. Now, this isn't necessarily going to be true with all cases. You might be doing some sort of tiling method or some sort of more impressionistic method where you could lay it in earlier depending on how your paint application system works out. I could even at this point, if I wanted to, just take the back of my brush and scrape into that dark. That would be the most appropriate thing. If I wanted to add a highlight in this early because I was feeling I just couldn't understand how things were looking, wasn't sure if it was right, and I absolutely couldn't resist putting it in at this point, which I understand that happens sometimes. The trick would be to not put it in with wet paint because it's such a delicate area. Taking a paper towel or a Q-tip or even the back of your brush and just lifting a little bit out to ensure that it stays a hard edge as well as a light shape would be the ideal choice. The real indicator as to how successful your painting is in terms of the structure and believability is if you're able to lay down without putting in details or tiny little accents like that, something that really looks strikingly like the subject without even the need to blend. So this idea of just laying down little pieces of paint, not tiling anything, but just getting color transitions to create all of your edge quality and getting the overall shape correct and overall value structure correct and overall color structure correct without having to do any softening or any tiny detail accent marks. That is the mark that your painting is correct and really going in a good direction. And things like highlights, accents, or softening edges are all things that will obscure your ability to see if you need to make corrections down the road. And so the longer you can go without doing any of those things, the better off ultimately your painting will be. I'm starting to make little strokes here following the form. I'm feeling as though I've got enough laid down where I can begin to build up thinking in terms of structure instead of just abstract pieces of light and dark. So as I went around the eyebrow, I started following the curvature of the eyebrow here. Now I'm starting to follow the curvature of the cheek here. With the reference photo, even though it's not super sharp, I did take the photo from where I was painting to make sure that all of the angles were correct. So it is less than super sharp, but you are actually able to see in the reference photo a lot more detail and information than I was able to see from where I was at, because we have, really blown up this eye here. And we can actually see some of the creases of the cheek as it follows the form of the cheek. And we can even see how some of the eyebrow hair kind of reflects the structure of the socket there. Those are all things that you can add in at home that I wasn't able to add into this painting, because you should be able to see them more clearly from this reference photo. Even some of the little accents of the bottom eyelid on that plane that faces the light is pretty clear. You just make sure that you don't blow that out. That's something that we see very frequently. That bottom eyelid, the plane that's facing the light, gets hit with way too much white in the mixture.
So would you always recommend having strokes follow the form, or is that sort of a preference and paint application thing?
That's definitely a preference in paint application. That's just gives a little more form. Typically, it's for paintings that are a little more classical or academic, where form trumps light and atmosphere. Whereas if I was painting something more alla prima or impressionistic, I would actually discourage that a little bit, because it can override the tendency to lose shapes and edges into areas because you're thinking too much about anatomy. But sometimes I use this technique to foil some areas to look really solid against areas that look really looser and impressionistic. So it can depend, but it is definitely a preferential thing. I would encourage you to do at least this method, and then if you want to be an alla prima, after you've done this method, do the more looser abstract version of it. But this will at least help you check your painting and check your accuracy a little bit, because you're doing this sort of imaginary sculpting over the model thing, where your brush is following the curvatures of the model and you're just trying to envision as though you're actually painting on the model with the direction of these strokes. Ultimately, if you build up more and more this way, it can look more and more natural, more and more like actual skin pulled over a skull, instead of just paint. And so it's a great way to really boost the dimensionality of your painting. That's why some people will look at a painting and say, wow, this looks even more real than a photograph looks. And a lot of that comes down to the subtle ways that the paint is being laid down on the surface. We pick up on all those subtleties. So it doesn't just look like a flat photograph. It actually has sort of this dimensionality and this rhythm where the strokes are all following that anatomy. I've got a much smaller badger brush here from Rosemary, It's a little tiny point, so I'm getting into some smaller shapes, but I'm still doing some significant paint load here. In this case, I have no medium on my paint whatsoever. I'm just dipping into pure body paint. So I need to use a brush that is able to load up a little more. I wouldn't use something like a comber here to go full on with body paint. It just wouldn't be able to lay the stroke down enough. I'd end up having to push so hard to lay the paint on that it would disrupt the layers underneath. So this Badger brush is a good compromise to where I don't have to press too hard, but I can really paint load and still get a soft stroke with a decent amount of paint on there. Again, just laying in little bits of color to affect those transitions, always remembering that it's a slightly different color or slightly different chroma, and that's what's going to give this that subtle variety that looks more like nature instead of just one flat shape. A lot of people would see that sort of triangle there underneath the eyebrow as being just one simple value or color and then just laid in like that, and it might look good from a distance, but up close it will look very flat, less dimensional. Whereas now it's almost like I'm building a clay sculpture here, where I'm adding just little pieces to create subtle variety in the surface. Trying to be really thoughtful with each stroke. Every time I lay one down, I have that pause where I'm assessing to see if I think it's correct or not. You can see how each of these pieces I'm laying down looks so close that they're almost the same color, but they're just a little bit different, almost indescribably so. And they're so close that, again, it's impossible to identify that and remix back into that each and every time. And so a bigger puddle is going to be required to lock into that subtlety. I noticed that my initial strokes were a little low in chroma, actually, as I started to build up some of the surrounding. And that happens sometimes, especially when I started with an underpainting that was really so low in chroma. The tendency there can be to push the chroma a little too low in your top painting. And it's okay if that happens if you've keyed everything to that, and then you end up with a more neutral painting overall. But if you're going for true color, when you get to the stage, you have to not be afraid to mix those chromas a little bit higher. And in this case, it doesn't take much. It's really just a little less blue in these mixtures. It's a little more heavily leaned towards red and yellow, and that makes everything look lighter and more intense, especially on the underside of the eye. But what you hopefully will have noticed is that as I laid those strokes down underneath the eye, it was almost the same value as what was there before. It was just a more intense chroma, less equal parts of red, yellow, and blue, more just red and yellow. And that really boosts that chroma higher, even if the value is the same. And it can affect more form change that way. This is how you shift the form with color instead of with value. We have a very limited amount of values that we can feasibly work with, but we have almost infinite amount of subtle color shifts. Notice I'm trying to be very delicate as I lay this paint down so that it doesn't get too thick and impasto. I don't want it to get kind of clumpy. And that can be a danger, especially if you're not thoroughly mixing your color on the palette. And so notice how I really mix and how I'm loading my brush as I do this. You know, I tend to mix it in, really push it around, understand the amount of paint that I have on my brush, and then be very delicate as I lay it in. I don't want to um, have too little paint or too much paint because that ends up disrupting the paint film. If I have too little paint, it actually will strip away the paint that I have laid down. If I have too much paint on there, it becomes this really big, unsatisfying clump of paint, which can be distracting for me to figure out the correct color or value or chroma. I'll be really careful as I start to approach the white of that eye there. Notice it's not much significantly lighter than the lights in the surrounding flesh tone. I'm holding off on the tiny little accent underneath the eye, that uh, bottom eyelid with the plane facing up. That produces a light mark that students, just like with the highlight, they tend to put in really early, and it's a very small shape, a very fine shape, and typically has some harder edges. So I'm a little more cautious about putting it in this early on. I still feel like I need to build up a little bit more of the structure around the eye before I hit something as specific as that. Notice whenever I need to make a significant color change, I'm not shy about how much paint I throw into that mixture. If it's a new mixture, I really want to try and use a lot of paint. Now, I could scrape off the paint and start with a new puddle, um, but because I'm doing the system where everything is kind of mixed by value, then that usually tells me that if I'm mixing a color that's the same as the value underneath it, then it's really just a matter of readjusting the red, yellow, and blue. So I don't really need to start with a new mixture because I already have some red, yellow, and blue in there, and I'm just modulating the amount of red, yellow, and blue in there. So I'm not needing to scrape it off completely. And that's in contrast to an idea like sort of impressionistic mixing, where you're trying to do one color and maybe another color with white to keep them as clean and vibrant and bright as possible. And so I'd want to clean off my palette a lot when doing that to keep my colors extra clean. Whereas here, it's just trying to keep everything really low chroma and just understanding that each value on there represents a specific group of red, yellow, and blue that I'm utilizing. And so I just keep locking into those red, yellows, and blues.
Your puddles of paint are really showing the value string that you were talking about earlier, going
Yeah.
from dark to light. And the darks are really chromatic.
Yeah. That's one of the benefits of not having to use white in them. I think we tend to forget that you can always lighten or darken colors with other colors instead of with a generic lightener or darkener. Now, there's cases a lot of times where students are mixing colors and they just throw in some alizarin or something kind of out of the blue, it seems. And I say, oh, well, why did you use the alizarin? And they say, oh, because it was a dark. And I say, but you didn't need any red at all in there. And they say, yeah, but alizarin was dark. And so it's not really a good argument. You only get half the battle that way. So you might be locking the value into a closer range, but you kill all of your chroma if you're not thinking about the color when you're modulating the value. So we have lots of choices in a palette like this on how to raise and lower the value, and those choices should be keyed to the color and chroma of the color we're trying to mix. And that's how we keep nice, rich, vibrant, clean colors. As soon as I started mixing like this, the colors of my paintings really expanded to just be really, really rich in general and less kind of monochrome, or less keyed, I would say. Less keyed and more like actual vibrancy of nature. And there's nothing wrong with a keyed painting. And in fact, I often look back at some of my older works and think about how nice they look. Even if they might not have been exactly what was up there, they were just keyed really well, and they have a sort of clean, coherent look to them. But if your goal is always to try to advance your understanding and get closer and closer to nature, eventually you need to break away from just a good key and learn how to paint what's actually there. Again, a little bit more of an advanced concept, I would think, but that is the direction you ultimately want to end up going. And if you think, our natural progression of color selection should be starting with monochrome, and then from monochrome going to a limited palette, which results in a key, a nice low chroma, typically key, and then from that key going to a more full palette like this, and we start to boost the chroma. But if you come here too early, you may end up in a situation where you just have such intense color and color all over the place that you can't handle it, and you don't have enough experience to be able to think about color as much because you're just trying to handle the shape and the value of everything in the paint application, which are all very, very tricky things to figure out. So remember, even though I'm utilizing this palette for this painting, it's not a requirement. You can definitely use a limited palette. You should probably start with some monochrome, and then from there build into more colorful paintings.
Are you thinking about color zones of the face at all while you're doing this study?
Not for something like just an eye or just a mouth or just an ear. Those color zones are largely intended for us to tackle just the major structure of the skull, so the forehead, cheeks, and chin and jaw. So we're not going to see as much color shifting here as far as zones. So it's really just trying to observe the color.
Seems like that's what it always comes down to.
Just observe correctly, yeah. Unfortunately, all of these videos would be pretty short if it was just, observe the color correctly and then just mix the color correctly and lay it down with the correct drawing. It's a bit of an oversimplification despite its truth. I tell people all the time that painting is not complex. It is challenging, but it's not complex, or it doesn't have to be complex. It can be complex. But it's, direct painting overall is relatively simple. It just hinges on, 100,000 correct, simple choices, all matching up. But if you think of it that way, then you can kind of alleviate some of the stress of painting, and just remember that Okay, you're just thinking about your shapes as far as their alignments, their plumbs and levels, all that. You're thinking about the values on a scale of 1 to 10, or maybe even 1 to 5, and then the color family, and then how chromatic is that color. You know, they're all pretty simple choices that we make, but you have to make those choices with just about every brush stroke, depending on what your layering process is. So again, yeah, it's not very complex. It's not anything that's super hard. It's almost a series of binary questions. You know, up, down, bigger, smaller, left, right. Those are your, you know, more angled, less angled. Those are your shape-ish questions. And then our value questions, it's lighter or darker. Our color questions, more red, more yellow, more blue. And if you ask yourself that, you know, 100,000 times, and you get the answer right for the majority of them, then you'll have a decent painting.
Sounds so easy now.
It's so easy. That's the secret, the key to painting. And if you squint, you're able to figure out those answers a lot easier. So that's the second key, is to squint. Unfortunately, that idea of it being so simplistic is one reason why some of the more studious students we have, who are really dedicated to the absorption of knowledge, don't always pan out to be the best students or the best painters, because all of those things that we just talked about really hinge on a developed sense of observation more than a base knowledge of tricks and formula. And to be a truly great painter, great observation is required, and no amount of watching videos by different artists and you know, little tricks of the trade is going to help you with that. It may help you in making a more aesthetically pleasing painting in general. I really think that, you know, if you want to take your work from an amateur look to something that looks a little more refined and sort of cohesive and a little more intentional, then watching instructional videos will certainly help. You know, I think any artist that has a very good aesthetic will help you with that. So you can look at videos by Daniel Keyes or Richard Schmidt or Michael Klein. They all have really great and unique aesthetics to them, or David LaFell, for example. And you can take a lower level set of observational skills and painting skills and create a work that looks higher quality than the actual skill set that you're able to achieve. You know, a painting that looks more refined, more like a professional painting, even if your skills aren't yet at the professional level. So those videos, I think, are fantastic for that, because you're really tapping into the aesthetic choices that those artists are making, as opposed to watching those videos to advance your skills, I think. And I think that's a pretty good distinction to make. You know, you're watching something like this in the hopes that you're going to be advancing your skill, not just learning fast tricks to becoming a good painter. But at some point, it's a good idea to pick up some of those other videos, other instructions, take other workshops to learn that aesthetic. You know, apply everything you've learned here, and tap into that quality that you're hoping to achieve. There is a danger, perhaps, in going a little too soon and focusing on just that aesthetic, because you may fall into the trap of avoiding advancing your skill sets in favor of the aesthetic. And if you fall into that trap, which I've seen happen quite frequently actually, then it's very difficult to push forward and become a better painter. You get stuck in this kind of limbo where you're painting the same sort of painting over and over and over again. Hopefully your curiosity will push you to maybe take some risks and push past that, but I've seen instances where some artists have been sort of stuck in their same painting and their same skill level for their whole career, and Sometimes it becomes a little disenchanting when you paint with them and you realize that what they're painting is so far removed from what they're observing that you just realize how much sort of trickery it is that they're using, how much they've just learned and they're putting in there as opposed to painting it. And when you stare at a painting by someone and for so long, you think, oh well, how did they do that? How are they setting it up to make those effects? And then you realize they're just falling on some of these rules of warm and cool, or common mixtures to make a color palette that they like, and instead of actually setting those things up and observing. There's nothing wrong with that if you're wanting to make those paintings, but a lot of us out there want to be one of those painters, at least I know I was, where you could sit down in front of just about anything and paint it. So, you're not a flower painter or a landscape painter, you're a painter. You can paint anything that you want just with your most precious tool, which is observation. After noodling with some of the micro for a while, I went back to the macro, and that's where I knocked in some of those major planes to help create a little bit more of the structure. Um, After I had laid in a few of those marks following the form, I realized that it wasn't quite dynamic enough, and I had to push it even further. But now it's starting to get closer, and I'm hoping I still have over an hour left, so that should be enough time for me to be able to get pretty close with the structure and then put some final details on top. But now we're having to get into some of these more subtle transitions here. See if I can bridge the gap between my lights and my darks without having to soften anything.
It seems scary to mix into a pile of paint like that.
Why so?
It just seems like I'd pick up a bunch of different color and value, and it'd end up looking blotchy on the canvas.
Yeah, I can sympathize with that. There are plenty of times when I've watched videos by other artists, and it seemed like they just mixed crazy things on there, and when they laid it on there, it just seemed to be like a perfect stroke that melted right into the surrounding area. And that will come with experience more and more. I'm not too concerned if I have a little bit of variety in each stroke, though. I am uh, not necessarily wanting to completely throw away the idea of a loaded brushstroke. A loaded brushstroke meaning there are perhaps little speckles of a variety of different color on my brush, and that it may come to where I lay a loaded brushstroke on and the color is just too far off for it to be correct. But I do understand that it is correctable at this stage, at least. I don't have anything that's like really permanent on here. It's still sort of all the structural stuff. So if there is an inaccuracy, it can be fixed. But other than that, this idea that all of the colors that I have on there are just comprised of the three colors for each value section means that I'm a little more devil may care with my mixing, because I know it's always easier to get it right back into where it has to go, since I'm not having to rely on this color plus this color makes this color, which is sort of those color charts from first term, and that's how I painted for a long time. And it does become stressful when you add a little too much or a little too little, or mix into a color on your palette, because you can go completely different directions and go all over the place. Versus this style of mixing where it's sort of like an expanded limited palette. It's a set of several different little limited palettes. So I can be a lot more carefree with it. And that just comes with more experience too. There's also a tiny amount of sort of visual memory that, the skill that you start to develop. It begins with drawing and then it carries over into painting. This idea that, when I lay a stroke down, it has a certain sort of flavor or feel to it, and I know it just needs to go a little bit redder, a little bit darker, a little bit lighter, and I can use that to more quickly mix into my mixture instead of having to completely observe a new color each time, if that makes sense. It's I lay a color down and I have an instant response as to the little way I might need to adjust it. And so I can mix faster and more freely into puddles. Whereas when I go into a new area, I have to mix a little bit longer and a little more thoughtful, and I have to sort of test the waters a little bit more. But that idea of visual memory is something that you'll need to build up to be a successful artist. Otherwise, each stroke is kind of reinventing the wheel. It's great for looser paintings like a Richard Schmid or a really direct, looser alla prima, but it's not necessary for something like this where you're hoping it's going to be a little more tight and a little more refined. So here I have my two brushes, and I'm going back and forth with my dark brush and my light brush to carve out that shape around the eye. Some of the strokes that are on there right now do have a little bit of glare, at least from this angle. I don't have it from the angle that I'm working in, but they are picking up from this angle. But luckily, later on in the video, a lot of this gets softened down before the final accents are made. And what you will notice is that as long as I stick true to the right value family and the right, for the most part, chroma, you can splice in a lot of colors and they'll look believable. Like colors at the turning of the form, you can throw in some, colors that aren't exactly what's up there, and it can still read as striking as and true. Even if the color family shifts a little bit, and especially with this really low chroma painting, the color family is shifting quite a bit. But it's that locking into the right chroma that helps to set a key. Locking into the right value helps to set a structure. Your actual color choices tend to be quite a bit more optional. You can get believability with a huge range of color choices. But that if your chroma is out of key, meaning the idea of dead shadows or too low chroma shadows or dead lights, too low chroma lights, or your value structure is off, which sort of sets the foundation for the dimensionality. If either of those are off, your painting is dead. It won't look correct. And it may be difficult to figure out where it looks off if you have so many choices that are um, different from what observation is. But the color itself, we can push around in a lot of different ways, and it can still look correct, both as a whole or in individual little pieces.
That was surprising to find out how little color matters compared to everything else.
Yeah, I think most people observe a painting and are really drawn to the color, or think that the color is responsible for a lot of the life-likeness, when really it's lower in the grand scheme of things. I mean, there are certain aspects of it, like the whole chroma idea is very important. But if you're consistent with either low chroma or high chroma, it pulls off. I think in general the color family is important. So as a whole, it has to read as generally the right color family for it to be believable. But the little specifics of color, there's a lot of wiggle room there. But you do need to create that variety we talked about. You know, if you have incorrect color and it's too simple, it may just look like a block-in.
So when you talk about splicing in color, does that mean shifting something a little bit more towards a certain hue, or?
Typically that means a loaded brush stroke or a small color where I've done a different color family,
Okay.
more so than adjusted the chroma. And it just allows a little bit more variety to happen in there. You know, with the amount of bouncing light there is around us, and reflectivity and just local variations, there are infinite little shifts in color family that we're observing, even though the chromas may stay relatively consistent and the values may stay relatively consistent. So we can splice in little variations of color family or little leanings towards other color families, to create the illusion of more detail, more texture, more subtlety. You can do this with a little brush, or you could even do it with just a loaded brush stroke. You know, if you ever watch a Richard Schmid video, he's a master at creating a loaded brush stroke, where he can paint a whole forest with a few brush strokes because of how it's loaded. I'm now starting to get in with some detail in the eye. I had gone through with my mongoose, or my badger blend rosemary brush, and softened everything, and for the most part softened everything up and down, cleaning the brush off as I went. That gave me a nice softer base tone to begin to lay some of my more little more finished marks on top of. I'll still do another softening before we're through, but I was starting to get so much variation and so much kind of randomness there, and different directional marks, that it was becoming distracting for me to advance the painting. And so I knocked all those down kind of uniformly, and now I'm able to build on top of it. And in this case, I'm starting to lay in with some information in the iris here, lifting up some of the value while I splice in some of these rich browns. And again, trying to find a little piece of color and value to create a slightly softer transition for the ball of the eye. I am actually kind of surprised how much information I did get in the eye for being so far away.
Yeah.
You know, we're looking at it, at least I'm looking at it now for the first time next to the photo, picture-in-picture that we have here. You know, this is painted from life, so you're never quite sure how close you got to what was there, necessarily until you really blow up that photo reference. And there's actually quite a bit of information that I was able to pack into that eye from so far away. But again, that's a testament more to experience and knowledge of anatomy, and then just careful observations of color. And I do really like this stage. You know, you'll see this in some of the other paintings, especially with portrait that we come up to. It's this, what we might call the noodle stage, where I've got this tiny little brush and I'm going in and really kind of coaxing out a subtle variety of the form going around the eye here. Really trying to advance little tiny micro variations of detail and of edge and of shape. Stuff that wouldn't necessarily happen in a direct alla prima painting. You know, I certainly wouldn't have enough time to paint to the level that I'm about to start painting in here, and I wouldn't be going with this small of a brush in a single session painting of a whole portrait. But this is kind of like the dessert where I've done all the hard work of laying in the structure of the eye, and now I get to relax and just kind of slowly go about to see how much information I can start to put in here, and just really give myself the luxury of slowing down and trying to observe even more carefully. You can see my brush moving.
You're going so
really
slow. You're really enjoying it.
It's kind of like eating an expensive chocolate, where you want to savor this. There's no need to rush at this point. I've pretty much painted an eye already, and I could, if I needed to, finish it off pretty quickly. And to be at this stage and still have 50 minutes left with the model is quite a treat, because now I just get to relax and just see how far I can take it. Kind of just a very calm state, which you don't always have.
I would guess the video was in slow motion right now.
It's quite the opposite of what we see in all of the extended videos that are sped up like 4 times, and it looks like I'm just throwing paint on. But you can see with this how slow I do start to go when treating some of these smaller detail shapes and little nuanced areas. And I think that's really important, because this is sort of the stage of the painting where it can get a little more dangerous. I'm putting in little tiny shapes and little tiny details, and if they get put in wrong, and you either have to go thicker on top of it, which could lose the surface quality of the paint application, or you have to wipe off, which could destroy your painting underneath. So I do want to be accurate. I do want to be really carefully observed. And I do want to proceed with this idea that if I don't get any more painted in, it's not going to be a big deal. So why rush? Just go slow, get it right, observe more carefully.
It seems like this is a stage where you could run into the danger of over modeling too, where you're just like kind of close to it, working on the small details, and you forget about the big picture.
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually a really huge danger. To avoid that, you'll see that I'm kind of bouncing around a little bit instead of staying localized in one area. I'm also leaning back quite a bit. I'm not super close to the painting, even though I am painting smaller shapes. But partially, my eye is so large. I painted this eye probably a little bit larger than life size, and that actually allows me to lean back a little more at a distance to observe it. But as you mentioned, you don't want to over model. So I'm still thinking as I proceed here, micro to macro, micro to macro. As I make these tiny little changes, I have this sort of slow pause afterwards where I kind of contemplate whether or not it's affected the overall shape or structure too much or too little before I proceed to another area. So even though I am going slow and noodling in a little area, each time I lay something like that down, it's just a long, careful observation as to, did that change the overall structure too much? And it did, and so now I'm going to knock it back down again. I over-modeled that iris there, and then I had to play it back down. So that has to be a concern each time. And it does fall along the lines of that lighter, darker, more red, more yellow, more blue, and then adjustment of shape. It's just more specifically thinking about it in terms of relationship to everything else. Often I'll have several different paintings going on in my own studio, some of them being very direct, some of them being very built up. Oh, there's the highlight. Built up and labored. And I do that because I have different moods when I come in. Sometimes I just really want to noodle. Sometimes I really want to slam something in. And so having a few different paintings set up helps satisfy that need. You can see I'm laying this in with a very fine badger brush that comes to a point, and I'm trying to make sure I keep this extra sharp, at least in the beginning. I may knock this down, but I want it to start out as really sharp to foil against everything else that I have on there. I'm also, again, as I did before, modulating ever so slightly the value and color of each of these highlights. I don't want any highlights to be the same color. And then also notice that I didn't go nearly close to pure white with this. It's quite a bit more reserved than a super white highlights. And that's the importance of setting up the surrounding color and value to ensure that you don't blow that highlight out. Every highlight does have color, and that color has to be keyed into the rest of the painting. And so, it made sense to actually just go right on top of a puddle that I was already mixing to lay that in. I noticed that I had some pupil underneath that highlight that I needed to paint. Also, I needed to crisp up that edge just a little bit, so I'm going in to actually shape those highlights just a bit as I lay in some of the darks around it, and even knocking down some of the value just a hair.
So are you having to paint around the highlight?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. It's very similar to what we would do in drawing, where we would erase in a highlight or lay some in with white chalk, and then we would take a really sharp HB and go right around it to crisp it up and sort of foil against the lightness and really make it stand out. I've just done that with some dark paint.
Okay.
Now for this little eyelid here. This is another area that can really help your painting sing if it's done well. Now hers eyelids aren't particularly moist. Often when we have somebody sitting under a bright light for a long period of time, their eyes tend to get a little more watery, and we do tend to see this as a really moist eyelid, in which case I would keep the edges a little bit sharper. Hers aren't overly shiny, and so even though I'm laying it in and it's a little sharper, we will knock it down, get it a little softer. This will actually tell me right away also if I overmodeled the white of the eye. If I got too much value variation in there, when I lay this light in, all of a sudden the eye will look too dark.
Do you have the binoculars out right now?
It doesn't look like it. I can kind of see my reflection in the mirror. I'm not really sure.
Yeah, because you're taking a little bit of time between mixing and putting down the stroke.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes that's just observation. Other times it might be utilizing the binoculars. I mean, for something like that, there's no binoculars needed. It would just be the really, really tiny shapes in that eyeball.
You're also just going so slowly. I wouldn't be surprised if you had like a nice tea or something, really taking your time and enjoying it. I've never seen you paint this slowly before.
Yeah.
I don't know if it would line up in class that I've just got like my drawing done, so now I'm going in with paint.
Right.
So I never see what you're doing.
Yeah, I only paint this way for specific types of painting, and usually for demonstrations in class, if I'm actually huddling people around for a demonstration, I don't get the opportunity to paint out this much. That's one reason why we're doing the videos here. But also for the pure fact that most students in class aren't ready for this level of render and this level of development, and so there's no need for me to get to this stage in a lot of cases to illustrate the point that we need to illustrate. So we do get to see, this is the advanced rendering ideas and concepts that only now are we starting into. Now that we've moved into a new facility, we're actually not in the facility that this was shot at anymore. We were part of the Scottsdale Artist School at this point. Now we are our own school with our own facility, and so we've transitioned from actually what this program was filmed for, which is a 2-year sort of really sped up training program, and we've been sort of shifting to a more classical approach to less of a everybody has to move along at this pace, and more everybody takes this curriculum and does it at their own pace when they're ready to advance. And that's proven to be a much more successful approach. I mean, you can see why it was done for the last 400 or 500 years. But only now that we've done that, and we've had students really focusing and going slow and really honing their craft for months at a time, every day out of the week, we're starting to get some students who are now, I think, ready to get this advanced rendering techniques that we have not been able to talk about ever before, which is rewarding in a lot of ways, not just for the students, but also for me to finally be able to get to talk about this sort of stuff. But we're just slowly dipping into this frontier. And then luckily for those at home watching the videos, you get to see that for all of these videos. You get to see how I would actually paint things. And so I've done some paintings like this, and I've done some paintings like the really direct, and I've done everything kind of in between. And so you really get a nice snapshot of all these methods. And that's, another great thing about uh, our school, as opposed to possibly some of the other more traditional schools, is that we do try to allow students to take their own uh, path instead of being rigid to the stylistic tendencies of a particular instructor. And so we have students who are going the really classical route. Some students who are even doing closed-roots eye paintings underneath and who are going to layer on top. And then we have students doing the really direct approach, and then everywhere in between. And so we're allowed that luxury of freedom where students can be guided in the direction that they want to go, which I think is important because we don't want everybody to turn out to be the same painter, but at the same time, it's really difficult to find a school that's going to have teachers skilled enough to be able to teach all those concepts of different styles of painting, so that the students can really get the higher level of instruction that they need.
Yeah, it's nice seeing the quality jump in everybody's work since the school kind of shifted to going full-time for students.
Yeah, it's I was actually really impressed. I thought students were doing amazing for what they were able to do with meeting only 2 days a week for 6 hours, and now that they're meeting 5 days a week for 30 hours total, it's and then also coming in on their own and working on their own and working with me more on a one-on-one level, even in my studio sometimes. The jump in quality has been beyond what I imagined.
It's fast too. It's all happening pretty fast.
Yeah. I would say this becomes the next hurdling block for students. Now that we're getting everybody up to the stage where they're producing all that solid structure and stuff is looking fundamentally right, I think the next hurdle that everyone faces in their artistic development is taking it from that general correctness and then pushing and learning to see better, more subtle, and then start to produce works that are on their own a higher, more resolved professional look. And everybody's going to hit that at a different rate. Some people pick up on it right away. Usually the people who've done a lot of master copies, who feel really comfortable in how their master they're studying works, then you tend to pick up the more professional quality more quickly. Now I'm really getting to noodle in to create some of these transitions here. Almost like little tiny hatch marks, I think is a good way to consider it. I dipped into a color on the left there to paint the white of the eye, and it looked so light in relation to the dark around it that I'm probably going to have to knock that down a little bit. But it just goes to show you that you can really get quite a bit of darkness in the white of the eye, or the gray of the eye, more aptly named. There is an edge quality variation around the iris that cannot be ignored. Even if from a distance it looks to be one solid edge quality all the way around, that will really flatten your eye out, look like a construction paper cutout. And so we have to observe that edge variation. You can actually see it pretty well in the photograph, actually, how it really starts to get soft at the bottom, a little crisper towards the middle, and then sharper on variety of points throughout. And so I'm going to be putting that into my painting, and that helps to describe the sort of spherical quality of the lens sitting on top of the eyeball there. Those tiny little hatch marks are now starting to build up to become a little bit distracting, so I'm just knocking that down with my rosemary badger brush so I can go right on top and advance everything a little bit more. Now this is just the most softest, delicate of touch that I'm doing with here because I'm really not wanting to mix any colors here. I'm just wanting to soften them out, soften the transitions and blend them. This is not something I'd be able to do if the paint buildup was really thick. I'd have to sort of adjust my edge hierarchy if I had thick paints to account for the edge that the thickness was creating, and then I end up having to push some edges even harder. Whereas now I have a decent amount of paint. It's fairly smooth on the canvas, and so I can just gently brush out some of these areas.
So how are you holding the brush right now? Are you at the very back?
I'm at the very back.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's typically what I do for the softest marks. I hold my brush so that the back point of the brush is actually hitting the middle of my palm, and I'm gripping it that way, just very lightly, almost as if I'm just cradling it, very similar to how I would with a pencil. And then I'm just gently letting it kind of fall across the surface of the canvas. The more we tend to choke the brush, hold it closer to the head, the rougher and harder our strokes tend to be. So for these really delicate ones, I'm really holding it from the back end.
So is it a little bit like when you're doing light veils and drawing? Because
Yeah.
that's something I had to learn where you kind of let gravity do a lot of it.
Yes,
In light
yeah.
veils?
It's very similar to
Okay.
this, yeah. Notice every once in a while I wipe off my brush and then I test it out on my canvas just to make sure that there's no little paint residues. Especially if you have a thicker buildup of paint, you might inadvertently pick some up and not get it with the wipeout, and then you will redeposit it elsewhere on the painting.
And that's not the kind of variation you want, right?
That's not. Usually it happens in the most inopportune place. Now, believe it or not, with as much time as I'm spending softening these adjacent areas around the eye, that is definitely not my main focus. I'm not going to paint that up too much, especially as I move into the nose. I'll end up leaving that very geometric and kind of blocky. There can be a real temptation to start to model that out. But my main focus is the eye and the eyeball and the eye shape. And so I'm just wanting to make sure that my edge key is kind of set with the surrounding area here, so I can go in for some really strong finishing edge marks on my eye, as opposed to really building up information around the eye. Smoking out the edges within the ball of the eye there really helps it read a little rounder.
That seems so dangerous that
It sure is. Just a light touch, knowing where the edge of my brush is, really knowing how clean it is. See there, I just deposited some paint. Oh no, what are we going to do? I think it'll be okay. It might actually just be picking up some glare.
okay. It's looking really nice and like all the forms look so rounded.
Yeah, and actually a lot of that happened with the application of the color with subtle value variations, and now with the softening of the edges, it just puts it over the top.
Mm-hmm.
So it definitely wouldn't feel this round if I didn't put in all that variation first. It might still feel round, but it wouldn't feel as round and natural. They are linked. You have to make sure you try to do both if you can. But the great thing about just laying on all that color first is that now I get to go around and just think about edge quality and how everything relates edgewise, just sort of bouncing around the form. Just really thinking solely about that before jumping back into my little details here. And I think of this now almost as drawing. I'm drawing with color now, really, especially for these final marks where I'm going to be following the form a lot more. It's just as if I was hatching with or veiling with a pencil. It's just I have to mix the color each time. I think that's probably why I like painting this way so much, even though I don't do very often, is that it reminds me so much of drawing, especially at this stage. And I really enjoy drawing. But this doesn't always bode well with a more direct or impressionistic style painting, which I tend to do more frequently. Um, but this really just, I get to think of it like I'm drawing.
When do you put the eyelashes on?
Well, judging by how much time we have left, I'm guessing it's pretty close to the end here. Notice every time after I do a softening, I do go back and start to think a little more about the structure thing, and so I end up making little modifications all around to correct or refine the structure instead of actually detail marks. Even though I'm using a small brush, all these marks here are structure marks. And so after I do all the structure stuff, I'll go back in and throw a little more detail in. And then I'll build that up until I need to soften it. Then I do the same thing over and over again. It goes back to the structure, the macro, and then into the micro. So we've got probably a little bit more of the structural correction. Yeah, just use it. Yeah, I'm kind of at a zen place right now with my little noodling, so stuff like that's not going to upset me.
Will you put that back with your glob of paint, or do you just leave it?
It just depends. I'll probably leave it.
So
It'll end up towards the bottom. Sometimes it sinks all the way to the bottom, and then I forget about it, and then I think I've just run out of paint, and so I lay more puddle on the top. Some of these structure marks now that I'm laying are starting to give a real solid feeling to the cheek and the whole zygomatic area. Locking into some of the more specific colors and details of the eyebrow. Remember, even with people with dark eyebrows, it's not just a flat, dark shape. We tend to get really graphic-looking portraits when students just really hit it too dark or with too hard of an edge. And you have to remember, it's fine hair, relatively transparent, especially when we have a bright light on the model. And towards the outer sides of it, we see just little bits of hairs going in different directions, and that tends to diffuse the color and value a little bit.
Like glob of red's taking all the paint with it, looks like.
Oh yeah, it's cleaning my palette for me.
That's the way to do it.
Let your tools work for you. Yeah, we might be going into the eyelashes now. It was a lot of dark paint I just mixed up.
I never really realized how strange an eye looks without
Without eyelashes, yeah.
I need some.
That's probably why students jump into the eyelashes at the very beginning, because it's, the highlight and the pupil and the eyelashes are those characteristic things that we sort of envision as defining the eye. And those are all little things that are accents that go on top of an eye after all that structure is built up. I can't imagine trying to build up the dimensionality of that eyelid after I've already had eyelashes put in. It would be almost impossible.
Working around eyelashes.
Yeah.
I don't think you touched that area very much, though, did you? The eyelid?
I went back on the inside and outside of it quite a bit. Maybe not the frontmost plane after I readjusted that chroma, but certainly the sides. It does have a lot of value and color shift to turn it away from the center, and that was a lot of subtlety that was built up. With the eyelashes, remember, they protrude directly forward, but following the curvature of the eye. So we should see them more slanted on the outsides of the eye, more directly vertical on the inside of the eye as it's following that fall.
How do you see that they're sort of a purplish from that distance? Is that...
I don't really know. And, even looking at the reference photo, I don't really know that they're necessarily that purplish. What I probably responded to was this idea that it was a dark shape in front of a light background, and that tends to create a bluish haze.
Oh.
That's definitely something that would be observable from a distance. So it's probably what's influencing some of my color mixture here.
Well, I wish I had years of experience.
You have to imagine it takes so many, drawings of an eye like this and so many paintings of an eye like this. And when I started painting in Chicago, I was trying to do just eyes for a long time, so I could then do eyes and nose, and then eyes, nose, and mouth, and then just get faster and faster. And no video will do the job of experience, although it sort of sets you much further along on the curve. If you're guided as to what to observe, you have a better chance at observing it. And that's something I tell students all the time. When they argue with me, oh, well, I can't see that. It's nice that you can see it, but I can't see it. And I say, well, I know you can't see it. You don't have the years of experience, and you've never had anyone telling you what you're supposed to be looking for to see it. And so now maybe you'll start seeing it. It's the same thing with why we take anatomy. So all of a sudden you start to see more curvatures and more forms than you saw before. It's just like when you buy a new car, all of a sudden you start to see that car everywhere when you're driving around, and you probably never noticed it before. It's the same idea. Once you're guided as to what to observe, you observe it more frequently. I'm using this Badger Brush Mongoose. Well, it's a Badger Brush Mongoose replacement from Rosemary to do these eyelashes here. It's really nice because since it's a natural brush, it's got a little tiny bit of irregularity. And so when I'm doing these eyelashes, it kind of breaks it up, and so it doesn't just look like a line that I'm adding in. It looks a little more natural, like pieces of hair. Same with this little bit of occlusion here that I'm painting in. I want that occlusion to be a little broken and a little varied, so it looks more natural than just a line. So a brush like the Badger helps me with that.
In the reference photo, the eyelashes are like very sharp in the front, and then they get like quickly softer as they move back. Is that something you can observe, or is that something that you'd only see in a photograph?
It's something you could observe if you get really, really
Right
close
next
to
to
the
the
model.
model.
Yeah, like we're talking 6 inches to a foot from the model, you'd probably observe that.
I thought you meant like face to face, inches away.
Well, 6 inches is pretty close. I think 6 inches falls within the bubble of someone's personal zone.
Yeah.
So you'd have to find somebody who will willingly let you do that.
Or just tip the model.
Just tip the model. Yeah. Tip the model a little more so you can get a little closer. Yeah, I certainly wouldn't advise doing a study like this from 10 or 15 feet away if you can avoid it. I did it out of necessity, especially I think the next one we see, which is the nose. That's in an open studio where I had zero control over any of the elements, and so I'm pretty far away for that one, as well as the ear. But I also, again, have that experience, and I have a slightly more advanced understanding of some of the anatomical shifts and angles of the anatomy, or of the features, and so I have a slightly higher chance of success from a distance. Whereas, if I was learning, like when I was at the Pal and Chisel, I would do anything I could to get closer to the model. I really, they had drawing horses up front, so I'd crank that drawing horse up as far as I could without, obstructing anybody's view behind me, just so that I could see a little bit more.
So you're adding more of the outline structure? Or
Yeah, just so I can actually resolve some of the edges a little more appropriately around the eyebrow.
hmm.
Again, it's difficult to handle edges independent of color and value, because then your edges will never quite look correct. Also, if I can get some more paint along the outlying areas and then really soften that out, that'll pull the eye into more focus, and it will look like crisper, harder edges within the eye without me having to actually go and paint harder edges within the eye. It can also have a very photographic sort of tilt shift effect, where just the center is really in focus and the surrounding is out of focus. It's just one of those things that makes the center look more real. And that is pretty close to how we observe, because we have two eyes. Since we have two eyes, we can only focus on one point, one area, and then the surrounding gets more fuzzy. So it's a more natural way to consider painting things than to just have everything in focus together. And that's something that you could adjust or modulate also depending on the scale of your painting. I don't think it's often done as much, for example, on life-size or larger paintings, because if you have a figure painting, for example, that is life-size, and you're looking at it, just like in nature, you, the viewer, can only focus on one area of that figure painting. So everything else will be naturally blurred out, and you, the artist, don't have to make the decision to tilt shift the rest of it. Whereas something that's really small, if you're doing a small, for example, 8 by 10 figure, or even a 12 by 16 figure, by painting the tilt shift in yourself, you're creating the illusion that it's a potentially larger painting, because when somebody looks at it, they're forcibly directed to the area that's in focus, and then the rest is out of focus, even if they can potentially see the whole painting in one shot. So I think in larger, especially more historic paintings, even though they had optical devices like the camera obscura that Vermeer used to create tilt shift and to create blur spots, it wasn't necessarily done on especially larger, more life-size paintings, because the viewer would produce the tilt shift themselves. Starting to knock down this transition on the side plane of the nose and the upper lateral cartilage. Um, we'll talk about that in the painting of the nose, but that side plane of the nose is something that students always knock down as being too dark, because it's put into context with typically the two side planes, which appear a little bit darker, and the front plane, which is in really direct light in many cases. So those side planes tend to be thought about or observed incorrectly as being much darker than they are, and so it tends to look like a dark line painted down the face of somebody. So it's a good idea to really observe the value of those side planes and make sure you don't over model them too darkly. I have to be really careful with that eyelid as I'm painting it in, because the model is a living model. I'm not working from a photo here, and so there are a lot of tilts and adjustments that she's making to try and stay in the right pose. And if this curvature is off even by a little, it completely changes either the perspective of the model's head or the anatomy of the model's eye. And so I want to really make sure I'm observing that correctly in relation to the lid above and all the other surrounding contextual points.
It's a pretty hard edge on that mark.
Yeah, I don't think I actually get around to knocking it down too much later on, but what I've done, probably without even realizing it, is sort of merging the edge quality just under the tear duct with the plane just to the left. I don't know if it's just from a distance, that's kind of how it looked, or if I just didn't end up having time to get in there and really adjust it. But since my main focus ended up being the eye, we had a limit to how much everything else got painted. But it does, that's edge quality there, even though it's a little inaccurate to ultimately what's in the reference photo at least, it does put a nice contextual hard edge next to the eye, which rounds the whole eye out, which it wouldn't be as round otherwise. There are some really hard edges right around that tear duct that are kind of essential for creating the softness or setting the key for the edge hierarchy to have all that softness in the eye. So it does need a hard edge there. It just would have been more apt or more appropriately placed if it were right underneath that tear duct instead of to the left of it. I was probably responding to that little fold of the crease of that top eyelid into the skull right next to it, which is the right side of that mark. And that edge quality I think is pretty solid, but the rest of it is just more of a stylistic mark. Now underneath the eye, I'm actually painting it, I think, a little bit bluer than at least what's in the reference photo. It may have been that way on the model, but on our reference photo, I think it's a little warmer, maybe in a little more purple underneath the eye than I'm actually painting it, which is a little more of a blue-green. But that does go to show you that if you're locking into the correct chroma and value, you do have a little wiggle room with the color for it to still look believable. It's not so far off that somebody might look at it and say, oh, wow, that just really doesn't look right because of that color under there, until they were to maybe look at a reference and say, oh, yeah, it is a little bit different. And that sort of demonstrates that flexibility of color that you can get away with. And that happens all over in this painting, all over probably every painting that you'll see in all of these video demonstrations. And it comes down to this idea of, is it so far off that it's reading incorrectly and you need to adjust the color, or is the value and chroma and color family close enough to where you can leave it and still have it play? That's something that can only be determined after years of experience, or by looking at master copies, or by asking an instructor. But for the most part, again, as long as your value and chroma are locked in, then you do have that little bit of flexibility with color. And that should alleviate, again, some of the stress in dealing with color. If it doesn't have to be 100% correct, which is easier to achieve than like value or chroma. With value, we've got really 10 solid steps of value. It has to be spot on. With chroma, we're dealing with some range, but it doesn't feel like as much of an infinite range as potential color can feel like, with so many different colors. So if we just think about, well, if you hit, the value correct, which you have a 1 in 10 shot of getting that right at least, and then the relative chroma, then which are the easier things to get, then you have a little more or a little less stress in trying to hit a color that's believable.
Yeah, I've seen a few paintings that are like crazy colors, like it's like garish almost.
Yeah.
But then I switched it to black and white, and it's like a smooth value gradation.
Yeah.
It's all in context. It's really strange.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of, if you get the value right, the painting is carried. But there was, historically special attention paid to the chroma of colors, but they didn't really call it the chroma of colors. They refer to it, like, as you said, as garish colors. Avoid garish colors, which can be interpreted in a variety of ways. But the way that they were, it's believed that they were describing it was more of the chroma, the intensity of colors. If you get chroma too high, it can tend to look less realistic. It can still play as a painting if your value structure is good, but it might not be believable. Whereas the actual color is much less relevant. But yeah, if your values are off, you don't really stand a shot. So let's just go back to drawing. All right, we're zeroing in here on our finish. Our last 10 minutes or so here with the model. And I'll probably do similar to what I've done in all of the other sittings here, which is first going through and softening some of the edges that might be a little distracting, then potentially working on some of the structure if it needs adjustment, and then finishing with the last fine-tunement of the details. So here we're just adjusting some of that edge quality, softening where we need to. And I'm just doing, now that it's the end of the painting, I'm doing it with a much smaller brush than I've used before. Even getting some of those softer edges on the bottom of the eyeball. There, I'm actually painting in between eyelashes.
Oh my gosh.
Not something that I typically want to have to do.
Is it to sharpen up any of those eyelashes?
Yeah.
Okay.
And also, just to give it a little bit more color, by putting the dark eyelashes on top, it lowered the overall value of an area. So, you do your best when setting the structure to anticipate that, but sometimes it's hard. And, just putting any mark on top of it adjusts our perception of it. And in this case, it just made the area a little too dark.
Was that just testing the color?
I have no idea. I don't allow myself many stray random marks for the sake of just doing it, but sometimes towards the end I'll let myself go a little bit. But the beginning has to be so carefully studied. I wouldn't want something haphazard landing on there in the beginning. But towards the end, actually in a lot of my paintings, especially the Alla Prima paintings, I'll do a lot of marks that are more intuitive just to make the whole painting feel more intuitive, even though it's a carefully studied painting. I don't think we'll see any other demonstrations where I don't clean my palette off at all throughout the whole painting. Um, it's pretty rare for me, but it does point out the fact that typically each little section of a painting has a dominant color family. Um, and if that dominant color family is pretty close together, then you don't really need to clean off your palette as much. You can just keep utilizing the color that's there as long as you're not using medium in there. If I were using, for example, the medium with the 5 parts mineral spirit, 1 part stand oil, 1 part Damar varnish, I would have to clean off my palette a lot more because that paint would become too tacky and stiff to actually mix into. But with pure paint like this, it's just going to stay wet on there. And so I don't really have to actually clean much off. If I was working a full portrait, though, I would probably need to clean off my palette quite a bit more because I would be working through different areas of the face, which do have different color zones in many instances, and which do have different local colors in different areas. And so a cleaner palette would be a little bit more required. But it's important to note that while a good palette, a good clean palette is nice, that doesn't necessarily mean you're automatically going to have nicer colors. You can have really great colors using a terrible palette. I've seen professional artists get away with doing a whole figure painting with a styrofoam plate, disposable plate, and they've made great paintings with awesome colors out of it. It really does fall into that whole, how you mix and how you observe. A lot more softening.
And you're softening since the model's on break.
Yeah. Although I don't know if she's like really on break or if she just took a little relax. Because we definitely don't have too much more to go. Yeah, because I have knowledge of anatomy, knowledge of how light falls onto form, I can do the softening while the model is not posed. Because my intent is not to modulate or alter any of the color that's there, it's just to soften transitions. And as long as I can marriage my knowledge with what I remember observing from the model, I can do a little bit of this while she's not there. Although I would not necessarily recommend doing this for a couple of years until you've really developed familiarity with these concepts and a skill of being able to manipulate the paint and a little bit more visual memory of the model. Our visual memory actually typically starts out very, very low, and that's one reason why students end up having so much trouble. We really only get a couple seconds that we remember something as subtle as the color mixture and the orientation of the shape. So there's some schools that will actually give their students exercises to do to help them with their visual memory, giving them shapes to observe, and then you have to wait 10 or 15 seconds and then try to draw the shape as exactly as you can. Little exercises like that help build up that skill.
Isn't there one exercise that some schools will do where you have like a model downstairs and then you have to measure it?
Yeah, I did hear about a school, I think it was supposed to be in England where they used to do that. I don't know what school or if they do or if that's just a rumor that somebody had started. But the more advanced students were on the top floor and the beginning intermediate students were on the bottom floor where the model was. And so the advanced students had to walk downstairs to observe the model and then walk upstairs to make all of their marks. So it really demanded that you have an understanding of anatomy and a built-up level of visual memory. We're just going in here, that's the last little bit, to just soften some edges. I don't even think the model is there anymore now. It's just a little bit here and there to put the final touches on the painting. I'll move to a bigger brush here to really start to blend some of the surrounding area into the edge. It looks like our camera went a little bit out of focus. Luckily that happened just the last couple minutes, so there's not going to be any real big changes here. Just some smaller bits of edge adjustment, of shape adjustments, but nothing too influential on the overall outcome of the painting. I did notice that that line was a little squiggly, perhaps, and so it just needed to be refined a little bit more. As long as I have the colors on the painting, I should be able to pretty much lock into them with my palette off to the left without too much trouble.
Must be nice.
Well, just keep working and observing and mixing color, and you'll be able to get to that point eventually. It certainly did help me by switching over to this method of mixing to be able to mix back into colors. When I was doing the one color plus another color and then white, sometimes I had and then free mixing from there, because that was usually my starting point, and then I did free mixing from there. It tended to be a lot more difficult to lock into color mixtures. But as long as you isolate the color on your canvas, there's no reason whatsoever that you shouldn't be able to mix the color to paint back in. I think what students run into is that it ends up taking so long to mix that color that they throw in the towel a little too early, and then they just start laying in color that's not close enough. And then they end up having to repaint whole sections of the painting, which is something that I used to have to do when I wasn't patient enough and when my color mixing skills weren't high enough. And so I just ended up making a rule that I would never paint back into an area. And then as my patience grew to where I would isolate more, and as my color mixing advanced, I was able to do it quite a bit more and more easily. The paint is set up to a nice sort of tacky, soft quality at this point, so I can do a lot of these really almost makeup brush blendings around the outsides. And then whenever I notice that that's really soft blending doesn't have enough of an impact on the turning of the form, that's when I will go in and add a little bit of paint to create a transition.
It's got a lot of nice little like claw marks in it, in the transitions and soft edges.
Yeah, there's a nice little bit of variety in there. If you can sneak in a few of those, it'll help to look more like actual flesh or actual hair instead of like plastic porcelain. But you're definitely gonna have to pick up a brush like the Badger brushes from Rosemary, or the combers from Rosemary, if you're gonna want to get some of those marks in. Just doing a little more thinking before the end here. And that's it.